A Flash Outside the Off Stump. Episode 1. Genesis.
English as tuppence, changing yet changeless as canal water, nestling in green nowhere, armoured and effete, bold flag bearer.
The late Viv Stanshall describing his fictional creation, the crumbling stately home Rawlinson's End, in his satire on the Victorian attitudes of the English upper classes. But his words, affectionate but biting at the same time, might just as well apply to another grand old institution, the game of cricket. In this series we'll be looking into the history of this fascinating sport, which in a few hundred years was transformed from an obscure game for bored shepherds into a national obsession and a cornerstone of empire. It was a game where players of all classes and races mixed, often for the first time in a social context, but which was also riven with barriers and contradictions. It's a story of prejudice, exploitation, division and discrimination. But it's also a story of talented individuals overturning expectations and triumphing against the odds. It's a tale that involves princes and potters, politicians and plantation workers. Our story exposes some of the racial and social stereotypes which underpin so much of Britain's imperial past, but at the same time introduces us to some inspirational characters, many of whom are largely forgotten today, but who in their day won the hearts of appreciative spectators and helped pave the way for the multicultural society we will one day become. Nobody really knows when cricket began or where it came from. Its origins are lost amid a mass of conflicting evidence, confusing references, mistranslations and wishful thinking. Some will gleefully tell you its origins aren't English at all, quoting references by the 16th century poet John Skelton to immigrants from Flanders playing the game, and pointing out that wicket and bail are both Norman French words. For others, this idea is total heresy, and it seems likely that 16th century Flanders folk were far more likely to be speaking Flemish than French. Fans of an English origin for the game will point to the fact that early cricket bats were curved like hockey sticks and had their origins in the shape of shepherd's crooks, and that the name cricket comes from the same root as crook, with the Anglo-Saxon word crick, meaning simply stick. We do know that cricket was fairly well established as a local rural pastime in the wealds of Kent, Surrey and Sussex by the end of the reign of Elizabeth I. Initially it seems to have been a fairly informal game played by villagers among themselves for the sheer fun of it, and may not at this stage have developed into a team sport at all. In the half-century before the English Civil War, as the religious mood in England swung towards Puritanism, the ecclesiastical records of these southeastern counties begin to be peppered with references to wayward parishioners being hauled up before the courts for playing cricket when they should have been in church. Cricket was duly added to the Puritans' hit list of sinful activities, as we can hear from this quote from George Swinnock describing events in 1631. "They are given over to vain sinful customs of sports. Maidstone was formerly a very profane town, insomuch as I have seen morris dancing, cudgel playing, stool ball, cricket, and many other sports, open and publicly on the Lord's Day." There is some evidence that cricket was already beginning to move up market, though. In 1629, a young curate, the Reverend Henry Cuffin, of Rocking, Kent, was charged with playing cricket in an unseemly manner with boys and other very mean and base personages of the parish. Cuffin countered the charges by testifying that he'd been playing with persons of repute and fashion. After the restoration of the monarchy in 1660, cricket resumed in the southeastern corner of England, and now it began to attract the attention of the local aristocracy. With aristocratic interest came gambling, and within a few years of becoming involved in cricket, wealthy men were wagering enormous sums on the outcome of matches. The arrival of money in the game was to have far-reaching consequences. It raised its profile, and matches began to be reported in the press, the more prestigious ones becoming popular social occasions attracting large crowds, necessitating the erection of stands for the spectators and booths for dining and drinking. By 1700, cricket had spread to London, and in the early 18th century spread along the south coast towards the west country and up the east coast to Northumberland and Scotland. The involvement of wealthier players and patrons also changed cricket in that teams began to travel further afield than the nearest village in search of opponents. Soon it became fairly common for these teams of the well-to-do to stylise themselves as representing their counties. But as aristocrats were often the titular overlords of counties they did not actually reside in, this could often be quite confusing. For example, the Sackville family, who lived at Knoll Park just outside Sevenoaks in Kent, were enthusiastic cricketers and played an enormously influential role in popularising the game. The head of the Sackville family held the title of Duke of Dorset, and his eldest son had the courtesy title of Earl of Middlesex. Thus it was that the Duke of Dorset came to bankroll a Kent team captained by Lord Middlesex. Among their frequent early opponents was the Sussex team run by the Duke of Richmond, and a Surrey team which featured no less a personage than Frederick, Prince of Wales. Frederick, son of George II and father of the future George III, was an ardent player and supporter of cricket, but came to an untimely end at the age of 44 from a burst abscess in the lung, possibly caused by a blow from a cricket ball. Games between these aristocratic teams almost always involve wagers, which could vary widely in size, as well as a great deal of secondary betting on the part of the spectators. It's worth taking a moment to look at some of the sums involved. In the early part of the 18th century, the Duke of Richmond would generally bet around 12 guineas a time for his Sussex team to win. But in 1730 he wagered 100 guineas on one game at Hyde Park, and the following year laid down 200 guineas on each of two matches against Middlesex. By 1751, some of the stakes laid on the outcomes of games were enormous. The Old Etonians versus England match that year was played for a formal wager of £1,500, with side bets totalling a further £20,000. To put that into context, it was at a time when an ordinary working man might have earned between £15 and £25 in a whole year. With such huge sums at stake, cricket was a serious business. Disputes over results meant disputes over money, and could, and did, lead to rioting, disorder, duels and court cases. It was to head off such outcomes that the great and good of the cricketing world first began to codify and standardise the rules of the game. By the end of the 18th century, the Marylebone Cricket Club at their home at Thomas Lord's Ground, then on the edge of London, were accepted as the arbiters and guardians of the game. At the same time, while some of the aristocratic players were of a very high standard, they were not necessarily the very best players in the land. In their desire to win at all costs, they set about recruiting professional players from lower down the social scale to beef up their teams. These early professionals were often hired in the guise of personal servants, gamekeepers, gardeners and grooms, with the Duke of Dorset said to be spending £1,000 a year on cricketing servants. One useful side effect of this was that cricketers employed as gardeners, such as England's best bowler of the time, Lumpy Stevens, drastically improved the quality of cricket pitches, changing them from rough patches of stony ground into the immaculately manicured surfaces familiar today. It may be assumed, therefore, that Stevens' nickname Lumpy referred to the quality of his bowling rather than to the quality of his cricket pitches. As the 18th century progressed, professional players did not always end up as the domestic servants of the aristocracy. Some acted as travelling mercenaries, turning out on a match fee basis as required. Others kept their nominal occupations but earned substantial appearance fees. In the 1770s and 80s, cricket was dominated by the Hambledon Club of Hampshire, a team so formidable that it repeatedly beat all England teams over a 20-year period. The membership of the club was drawn from the gentry and aristocracy, who paid 3 guineas a year for the privilege. This enabled them to build a strong team of professionals drawn from across the entire south of England. The players earned 3 or 4 shillings for every practice session and match, well above the average agricultural daily wage of the time. Even more impressively, they could earn a bonus for winning a match of 5 guineas, equivalent to about £750 in today's money. However, while the professionals were well paid by the standards of other working men, it was the gentlemen who stood to make the real profits, with Hambledon matches normally being dependent on a 500 guinea wager on the outcome. With Hambledon's impressive playing record, its gentlemen members were undoubtedly doing very well indeed from the exploits of their professional employees. The distinction between gentlemen and players was to last until the MCC finally abolished it in 1963. To the outsider, the distinction is usually assumed to be between amateurs playing for the love of the sport and professionals from humbler backgrounds who wouldn't be able to afford to commit time to the sport without a financial incentive. However, This has rarely been the case. Even when gambling ceased to be a source of income for the gentleman player, they still often earned more from the game than their professional counterparts through the payment of generous expenses or by holding well-paid administrative positions within clubs. For example, when an England team toured Australia in the winter of 1891-2, the amateur W.G. Grace was paid £3,000 with an expenses-paid trip for his wife and children thrown in. The professional members of the team received a mere £300 and had to leave their families at home. Altogether, throughout the course of his amateur career, Grace earned in excess of £120,000, a huge sum at that time. In addition to their very generous expenses, amateurs also often received very generous gifts in their testimonial years. Not only were these often worth 2 to 4 times as much as the cash benefits paid to professionals for their benefit seasons, but clubs would also typically hold back half a professional's benefit money in trust, in the belief that a working man with a lump sum would be liable to fritter it all away on drinking and gambling. By Grace's time, the distinction between gentlemen and players, celebrated in an annual match between the best of both, were enshrined in the very fabric of the game. The county cricket clubs were largely run by the aristocracy, even though the bulk of their supporters increasingly came from humbler backgrounds. Anxious to preserve what they saw as proper social order, the grandees in charge of the game sought to establish county matches as the preeminent form of cricket in the domestic game. Partly this was a move to head off the touring teams of professionals, who played against teams of all-comers, from getting too much economic power. And partly it was a useful way for the landed gentry to remind the increasingly urban working classes of their traditional identities and loyalties. For the men who ran county cricket, class was an important issue. Most county teams were captained by amateurs, as it was considered unseemly that a working man, however talented, should be put in the position of commanding those considered his social betters. This led to the anomaly that teams sometimes took to the field captained by their youngest or least able players. This adherence to social distinctions was manifested in other ways too. In the programmes and scoresheets, amateurs' initials were displayed. Professionals were merely referred to by their surnames. Similarly, when the gentlemen in a team addressed their professional colleagues, it was by their surname only, but the professional was expected to address them as Sir or Mr. Failure to observe these social niceties by professionals could lead to permanent dismissal. Finally, as the great cricket grounds of the late Victorian period built brand new pavilions, the social distinctions were enshrined in stone as separate entrances and dressing rooms were constructed for the gentlemen and players, and separate seating areas became the norm for the different classes of spectator. Not everybody found this to be a positive development. Writing in Annals of Lords and History of the MCC in 1903, Alfred D. Taylor lamented the loss of the more casual attitudes of days gone by.
The cobbler no longer associates with the duke, or the farmer with the squire. The plebs that pays its shillings is marked off with painful distinction from the patrons who are entitled to higher honour. No longer do the masses mingle with society. The game is robbed of its old world charm. Lord's is Lord's no longer. It is an amphitheatre for gladiatorial contests with its massive and mighty circle of seats, stands, boxes and buildings. MCC is a club no longer. It is a national institution.
By the time Taylor wrote these words, cricket had progressed from its obscure origins in the hills of southeast England to become the preferred summer sport for all levels of society, not just at home, but throughout Britain's enormous global empire and beyond. And in the next episode, we'll be looking at just how cricket spread beyond these shores.
Cricket, lovely cricket, at last where I saw it. Cricket, lovely cricket, at last where I saw it. Yardley tried his best, Goddard won the test. They gave the crowd plenty fun. The second test and West Indies won. With those little